Grazie. Good afternoon. I'm glad to introduce this section organized with the keynote lecture by Karel Marten, followed by a discussion introduced by Ezio Manzini and Morena Pivetti. Ezio Manzini is the author of a quite a known book, Abitare la prossimità. Morena Pivetti is the coordinator of the report Mobilità e Logistica Sostenibile del MIT. So the title of the lecture by Karel Marten is Leveraging Transport Justice to Build a New Transport Future, and it's a general reflection on the theme of post-scarcity, and it relates to concept over transport justice. Karel Marten is professor at the Faculty of Architectural and Town Planning at Israel Institute of Technology, and his research, culminating in the book Transport Justice, Design for a Fair Transportation System, focus on an approach that integrates equity in defining a set of principles that can guide transport policy. What, in my opinion, distinguishes Marten's research from other contributions on transport and mobility justice is the research for operational tools based on explicit principle of justice to address transportation planning. And in the work of Marten's, accessibility concerns not only the functioning of the transport system, but also the ability of each person to access opportunity. And acting as a social indicator becomes a tool to measure what is called by Karel Marten's activity participation, that can be a relevant tool for measuring the minimum threshold of accessibility as a basic accessibility that allow everyone to take part in valuable social activity. And this research is also relevant because transport justice is not just about transport, but rather is one of the crucial political and ethical issues of the contemporary world, in which we face a series of crises related to how we move. The research the team addressed in the research of Karel Martens are, in my opinion, particularly relevant for dealing with the post-scarcity scenario, at least for the following reason. The first, for questioning what are the implications in terms of social justice of a post-scarcity scenario. The second one, which kind of services, opportunity should be equitable, distributed, and offered in proximity to meet diverse needs of different social groups and avoiding reproducing existing inequalities. And also in terms of what kind of measure, what kind of approach we can use for evaluating accessibility by proximity concept, not in a traditional way, as a tool for assess transportation system efficiency and capacity, but also for measure the availability of services and the capability of each person to be access to relevant daily opportunity. So I leave the floor to Karel Marten for his lecture, and then I invite the two discussants to deal with him. Thanks.
Thank you, Paola, for your kind words. an introduction to my work. I don't know who has to move from that screen to my screen, but it would be helpful.
Potete proiettare le slide? Grazie.
This was very helpful. So I did practice for 2 weeks some Italian before I came here, but it wasn't even enough to ask the right slides on the screen. So I'll keep practicing after today. I'm very honored to be here in this wonderful city and beautiful context, and this important work, I think, by Urban IT on post-car cities. And I want to link it to my work, and it's for me a new challenge, because I didn't think from that perspective so much. But I think transport justice, which is the slogan of my work, you can say, or the summary of what I've been doing for the past 15 years, and post-car cities go very well together, but maybe in a different way than you might think. Now I think the dream of car-free living was born slightly later than the car itself, but not much later. I think towards the 60s, end of the 60s, early 70s, there were already people that were dreaming of a different society in which the car was less dominant. They saw what was happening in cities around Europe, and how historically built city centers, built for walking, were slowly flooded by cars, and how this made cities worse. And that dream has become slowly more real, and both at the neighborhood scale and at the city scale, I would say. And at the neighborhood scale, we see more and more initiatives for building car-free neighborhoods. And we know all famous cases like Vauban in Freiburg, which is very well known and very reported on. But there were actually older ones and more modest ones that also happened around Europe. And this is just one example from Cologne, where a very small development was car-free with some modest parking availability at a distance. Now, these small developments are slowly getting mass, I could say. And one example is a new neighborhood being currently developed in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and I will return to the city later on, which is called Merwede, and where they're planning a neighborhood for 12,000 people. So this is a substantial scale neighborhood where there will be no cars in the neighborhood itself, and only 1 in 5 households can own a car and have parking remotely from that new neighborhood. So you could say car-free living is coming of age, it's getting proper scale, it's becoming seriously considered in urban planning. And the same is happening at the urban scale, you could say. Since the late 60s, cities have been closing off their city centers, but they're taking it now to the next level, you could say. And one case is Oslo, where they have decided to, in the coming 10 years, gradually expand the city center, car-free city center. It's not completely car-free, and that's why I like the title of the report published in Italy, Post-Car is probably better, meaning the car has a role, but it's a small role, it's not dominant anymore. And cities like Oslo, but also Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Madrid, Milan are slowly working towards that. And the interesting thing, I think, is that cities that used to be very, very car-oriented are also making that switch. So just 2 examples. Brussels, for those who have been there 10 years ago, it was still very, very dominated by cars. And they, in 10 years' time, made a huge shift towards a very different approach. Now, it might be temporary, it might be dependent on politicians, but it seems to be gaining momentum. Another, I think, a very interesting case is Birmingham, which is known in the UK as a motor city and known for its very wide roads and high-speed arterials running into the city, which has also decided to actually gradually move away from the car. I think these are very, very interesting examples and inspiring in a way, but I think they're also threatening for some part of the population, and we'll try to explain why this is the case. Because I think there's a certain discourse around car-free living. And the discourse, I think, is in a way very positive. It inspires and depicts a new future, a very different future where people and city life go together, where it's very pleasant to get around, where also if you don't have a car, you can get to places, where quality of life is higher, pollution is lower, road deaths are brought to zero, and who could be against it? But at the same time, it is also a vision that is a kind of a privilege, because population groups are slowly pushed out of the city center, and who can actually live a car-free life are those who are better off. And I think this has to do with the framing also in the academic discourse about how we frame car-free living and post-car society. And it's linked to the trends we see in attitudes of people. And those attitudes are represented in phenomena like peak travel, where we see gradually that car use is not increasing anymore, but even decreasing in some cities. We see shifting patterns among the young. They have car licenses later. And so we see a cultural shift, you could say, away from the car. And the discourse around post-car living is building on that cultural shift. And just to give one example of how we observe these changes is a work by Berry on car ownership in Italian households. And he analyzed how many cars households had when the household head, so the main person in the household, was between 35 and 39 years old, and he analyzed that across lots of generations, from before 1910 up till more or less my generation. And so he analyzed, okay, when these people were between 35 and 39, how many cars did they have on average in their households? And he did so for both the north of Italy and the south of Italy. And he found the following trend. And you see, obviously, what we would expect, a strong increase in the number of cars per household, going on average beyond 1.2. But what we see towards the end of the curve, and he didn't go further, we see a decrease, right? So my generation has less cars on average per household than previous generations, than my parents' generation. And a small anecdote, so when I was about 12 years old, I think my parents took me with my 3 brothers to the train station close to my small town, and my father put us on the train with my mother, and he drove with the car to the next station, and we drove with my mother to the next station. And so when we came out of the station, my father said, "So now you have seen what a train is, because you will never ever use it again." And his philosophy was, I managed to move from being carless and even bikeless, he came from a poor farmer's family, to being a car-owning family, and there's no reason that you will be worse off, and being better off means living without a car. I managed to live for many, many years without a car, but not anymore, I must honestly admit. So the generational trend is certainly, in my case, happening gradually. Now these trends are strengthened the idea that there's a shift in people's attitudes towards the car, and the car is less this desirable thing for people, and we desire other things, is what is basically behind this post-car, car-free, or more maybe the car-free discourse. And there's not so much research, interestingly enough, about car-free neighborhoods, but there's one study I found from Vienna, and they analyzed what is the household profile of people living in a car-free project, and they didn't specify which project, interestingly enough, in their study, and the entire city of Vienna. And so they analyzed through a questionnaire the people in the neighborhood, and from statistics from the city of Vienna. And these are some interesting statistics. So what we see is actually that people living in the car-free neighborhoods have larger households and more children, which I think goes together with the story that we see a shift here in a preference for a car. It's not just small households without cars that can easily manage, without children that can easily manage without cars. There are actually quite large families that have children, which is supposedly making it difficult to live without a car. But more interestingly, I think, are two different statistics. And so one shows that actually the number of white-collar workers in the car-free neighborhood is twice as high as in the entire city of Vienna. And even more impressive is a difference in educational level. So 4 times as much people in the car-free project have a university degree as living in the entire city of Vienna. Another interesting thing is that actually income levels are not so different on average. These are not wealthy people. These are people that are actually choosing a different lifestyle. They're changing. And if you calculate per head of the population, they actually have lower incomes. So we're talking here about you could say, an avant-garde, people that choose a different lifestyle and that are ahead of the crowd. And that's where we're going to, gradually. Another idea that links to this discourse of having a shifting attitude towards the car is the phenomenon of zero-car households. And so Brown analyzed this concept. What are zero-car households? And she says, well, there's actually two different groups. There are carless, which don't have a car because they have constraints. They have no income, they might not have a driving license, or they might not be able to drive for whatever reason, and that's why they don't have a car. But there are also car-free households. And they have a car, they don't have a car out of choice. They could have a car, they have sufficient income, but they don't. And through a questionnaire, she analyzed this. And the interesting thing is that 1 in 5 actually is car-free. So of all the households, this was a sample in the US, of all the households who don't have a car, actually 1 in 5 is voluntarily carless. Again, strengthening this idea that we see a new trend of people moving away from the car. There's another phenomenon which is called household demotorization. So if we want to move to our car light lifestyle, we should actually analyze more deeply households that get rid of a car, that demotorize, that used to have a car and that get away from having a car. And a study by two people, I can't pronounce their name, they might be Italians, but you can tell me, summarized the results of various studies, analyzing how many people in each year actually move from 1 or 2 cars to 0 cars. And the results are quite interesting. So between 3% up to 7% of households actually move from having a car in any given year towards having no car. Okay? Now, the same is happening in the opposite direction, okay? So it doesn't mean that car ownership on average is going down. There's also people moving from no cars to having cars. But there's a substantial share of people with a car that actually move to having no car anymore. And this, again, relates to an opportunity to change maybe their behavior permanently. And a Dutch colleague of mine, Nieuwenhuizen, he developed the idea of an information cycle to support a shift to car-free cities based on that idea that our attitudes are changing towards the car. And if we can ride that attitude change, we can actually build slowly, gradually, car-free or post-car cities. And this information cycle goes as follows. So the key in the change are decision makers. They have to understand that moving to car-free cities actually has a benefit. I need my glasses, otherwise I can't read what's on my own slides. Now, if they understand how important it is to move away from cars and to move towards car-free cities, we can move to the next step. But if they don't, we have to move to give them more information. We have to provide them information on the health and environmental benefits of car-free living. And if we give them more information, the idea is then they will understand. And we can move to the next step. Then we have to ask the population the same thing. Does the population understand what are the benefits of car-free or car-light living? If they don't, we have to give them more information. Once they know the tremendous benefits for health and the environment, more and more will understand. So if they understand, we can move to the next step and we can actually start building towards a car-free city. Land use can change. We can make different investments in our infrastructure. But that's not enough, because people also have to change their behaviors. So there's a next step. We have to make sure the population is ready for change. If they are not ready yet, we have to give them more information, explain them the benefits, and then they will be ready. And only then we can actually transition to a car-free city. Now, my perspective is that there seems to be a kind of implicit idea behind this development. It's like we have to go through a development, all of us gradually, and only when we go through this development we can move to the final stage, which is car-free or car-light living. And I would say it goes a little bit like this. So it's an adoption philosophy of a car-free living lifestyle. So on the one axis there is time, and on the y-axis there is a level of car ownership. And if we go back 50, 60, 70, 80 years, then obviously most of it will be in this left corner. We wouldn't have a car, and we would get around by walking, cycling, and public transport, which was very common. And then gradually, we moved into having 1 car, and more households moved into having 2 cars, and gradually more households move into having even more than 2 cars, even though we do a little bit environmental things, and we actually buy an electrical car instead of a regular car. Now, when we are there, when we went through all the stages and we learned what it is to have multiple cars and the drawbacks of it, then we can move to the next stage where we gradually get rid of 1 car at least, and we have 1 car and 1 shared car. And that's where I am. And then finally, the ultimate step is moving to car sharing and having no ownership anymore ourselves. But this is the adoption philosophy, I would say. So everybody has to go through this thing, and we have to catch the people who are already ready or could buy 1 or 2 cars or even more cars, that have the right attitude and environmental awareness, and we can shift them towards car-free living. Now, I think we miss a very important opportunity here, and let me explain this in a minute. So let's shift first the perspective before I explain what I mean, that we miss something very, very important. Let's switch the perspective, and I'm now getting to my own work. And imagine I would ask any one of these people on this picture a very simple question about transport. I would ask them the following question: should the transport system serve everyone? And I've done this actually in practice, okay? Somebody outside the domain, I ask, do you think that the transport system should serve everyone? And their answer is very, very obvious and also maybe very weird. The answer is yes, with a question mark. Why do you ask me this? It is obvious that the transport system has to serve everyone. Why do you ask this question? I think if you will try this in the street in Bologna, you will get the same response. It seems such an obvious question, or such an obvious thing to achieve. We are all dependent on the transport system, right? All of us. So it should serve all of us, shouldn't it? Can there be something else you can imagine? And yet, what we have done for decades, for 70 years, since transport planning came of age in the 60s, we've basically focused on something else. We have never asked that question. We have focused on solving congestion, and solving congestion again, and seeing it return, and solving it again, and seeing it return, and seeing it return endlessly. And gradually, over the past 20, 30 years, we have moved to addressing the negative externalities. We have never really analyzed, does the transport system serve everyone? That's a question we have never asked as a transport community. Now, maybe because it's not so obvious what it means, serving everyone. What does it actually mean? When does a transport system actually serve everyone? So this was, for me, in a way, the question I asked about 15 years ago, and it took me quite some time to move forward. And it results in this book I wrote, Transport Justice, because serving everyone is basically about the question, what does everybody deserve, right? If everybody gets what is deserved, everybody is served well. And the core of the book is basically a philosophical thought experiment, and I won't make it very long, but very short. I will take you through this thought experiment. And I've taken a basic concept of John Rawls, a well-known philosopher from the 20th century, and this device is called the veil of ignorance. And he requires from people to imagine that they are behind the veil of ignorance and do not know who they will be in society. And while they sit behind the veil of ignorance, in Rawls' work, they have to think about how we distribute income and liberties and so forth. And in my case, I want to ask people, you're sitting behind the veil of ignorance, now you have to design the transport system. And so you have to design the transport system not knowing who you will be in the real world, right? You might be a man or a woman, you might be rich or poor, you might be old or young, and you might be completely healthy or with impairments. And not knowing who you are, you have to design a transport system. And there's one important condition. The moment you have designed it, you're stuck with it. You cannot change it afterwards through democratic elections, okay? This is what you have to live with. It's not like, okay, you know, I'll just do something and then we'll see. And if I don't like it afterwards, I can change it through... No. You have to live with the consequences of your decisions behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing who you will be. What you do know is that there is something like a city, there is centers and periphery, there is transport systems, there are people with all their diversity, some people who like to drive, some people who don't like to drive, some people have difficulties getting on public transport, some people like to cycle. There's a huge variety. Now, knowing this variety, you have to design a system that serves everyone. And you're behind the veil of ignorance, and you have to design it while you don't know what you are. And the moment the veil is then lifted, you might be possibly poor, or you might be with impairments, or you might be very wealthy and without any impairments. It might be anything. Now, not knowing who you will be, and knowing that you will have to live with that system, the only thing you will agree on is that a system that will serve you well enough, right? You will not accept something that when you have no money, you can't get to places. Now, on the other hand, you don't want to spend all your money on the transport system. I mean, somebody has to finance the transport system, right? It doesn't come for free. So if you say, you know, everybody has super transport system is very expensive. So it means that you, from your hard-earned money, have to give up lots of money to build a super transport system. Well, you think that's too much. I want to keep my money for other things also, right? After the veil is lifted. And so I will be stingy, but not so stingy that I will find myself in trouble after the veil is lifted. And so basically, going through this thought experiment and balancing between your best interest, which is making sure you have something that serves you, whatever the situation, and not spending too much on transport, you come up with a simple transport system, a very simple one. And it says this: a fair transport system is a transport system that provides everybody with sufficient accessibility. So sufficient accessibility means you can get to all the places you need to get to work, to see your family and friends, to go to sports, to go to nature. Sufficient accessibility to destinations. You don't need more than sufficient, because that would be meaning spending lots of money, right, to get more than that. But you wouldn't accept less, because if you have insufficient, then clearly you're struggling, right? You might not get a job. You might not see your family and friends because it's difficult to get there. Now, this is defined from the transport system perspective. You can also define it from a people perspective. And then basically we have a new basic right. And the basic right reads, every person is entitled to a sufficient level of accessibility. Now, we know from the literature that in the current situation, the society we have built over this past 70, 80 years, some people are served very, very well, and they have very high level of accessibility. And it's mostly people who have access to a car. Even with congestion, they get to places very fast. They sit in congestion because it's their fastest way from A to B. If it wouldn't be, they would choose an alternative. They don't, because it's the fastest way. Often even the cheapest way in terms of tax paying. You already paid for your car, out-of-pocket costs are low. And often it's also the most comfortable way. And usually it's all three together. It's very rare that's not the case. So there's a group that's very well served in general. Not everywhere, but in general. And there are groups at risk of low accessibility. And we also know those groups. People on low income who can't afford cars. And even if they have a car, they might not be able to repair it when it's needed or run it for every trip because it's expensive. Some people with impairments who cannot drive and then are faced with other things. Children, more or less completely ignored in urban planning. Immigrants often come without a driving license, don't speak the language, don't manage how to learn how to drive because of the language barriers, because of the limited income. And a group that we don't research at all, people who are scared to drive. Percentages of the population are scared to drive. They might not drive at all because of this. They might not drive in the night because of this. They might not drive on highways because of this. And part of those group is elderly people, where we see that their ability to drive goes gradually down from everywhere to not on the highway anymore, only the roads we know anymore, only to that son or daughter that's close by. And basically, then we say if people don't have a car, they have risk of low accessibility. This is certainly true depending on where they live. So unless they live in a city center, that might maybe be enough. But if they don't live there, they're at odds of low accessibility. And so what is the purpose and the goal of transport planning then is providing sufficient accessibility to all. That is the goal. That is the most important goal. The budgets should flow to there. That is what we agreed upon behind the veil of ignorance. We promised everybody sufficient. That's what we agreed upon between each other. That's the social contract that you design behind the veil of ignorance. And that's what we have to provide. And so our duty as transport planners would be then to gradually improve accessibility over time. Now, what does it imply? And how does it link to car-free cities? Let me explain. I presented statistics on the number of people who are car-free versus who are car-less, right? And we found the impressive result that 1 in 5 households without a car are car-free. They choose to live without a car. Very promising. We can ride that wave for our post-car cities. But more interestingly, 4 in 5 doesn't have a car because they can't own a car, can't drive a car, right? Now, these are also part of our post-car city, potentially, right? Why do we ignore them? Now, let's analyze where they are. Where are they in terms of income and where are they in terms of location? Now, if we analyze in terms of, and these are statistics from the US again, in terms of income, surprisingly, there are car-free households and even car-less households across all income groups. But most of them in both groups are actually in the low-income groups. That's where the vast majority is of people without a car. There are more people who are car-less than car-free in the low-income groups, and it switches when income goes up. There are more car-free households and less car-less households because it becomes more a choice. Income is not a barrier, but there's actually a huge group of people with low income that do not have a car out of choice, but often out of constraint. Now let's see how this works out in two cities, two extreme cases. One is Atlanta, and the other I go to Holland. I don't have data for, unfortunately for Italy, I would have loved to present the same analysis. So Atlanta, car-based city completely, right? So you won't be amazed that this is the pattern of accessibility by public transport, right? It's the typical classical geographical model, high accessibility in the center, and then it rapidly goes down to close to zero accessibility. Now, if sufficient accessibility is a standard you set, right? That's what the outcome of the philosophical argument is, sufficient accessibility for all. Let's set a standard. So I set as a standard 10% of average car-based accessibility in this huge region. Okay, this region is about 200 kilometers from east to west and from north to south. We're talking a big metro region of more than 5 million people. The average car accessibility in that region is X number of jobs in 30 minutes or in 45 minutes, it doesn't matter. And we take 10% of that, and that's the standard. If you're below 10%, you don't get enough. If you're above, you're doing fine. We get this pattern, which you also might expect. There's a tiny area in the center, 2 by 2 kilometer, I estimate, which is above the sufficiency line in the US, and all the rest is below it. And the more dark blue it gets, the more you are very, 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 very far below it, and on the edges you're just at zero. You have zero accessibility by public transport. It might not come as a surprise in the US, right? And it drives our attention towards these areas where nobody would talk about car-free living, right? We talk about car-free living in cities. But then if we start mapping who are the people that are already living car-free, we see a very different pattern. We actually see them living quite close to the city center and in large suburbs with substantial densities, even in the US. They are not spread far out, they live much more close to the central district. And if we take into account how far they are from the sufficiency line and how many people live there, we get this pattern of what I call hotspots that need more transit accessibility. If we want to bring them above the sufficiency line, this is where we should start, in these hotspots. They have low accessibility, has lots of people. If we invest a little bit, we can bring them above the sufficiency line. If we would set a higher line, they would be even closer to the city center, because even if you're close to the city center, you fall below the sufficiency line. Now, this is not only out of just as important, I would say these are hotspots for post-car living. This is where the opportunity is. These are where lots of people are already living without cars. And so even in the US, surprisingly, there are neighborhoods where more than 25% of households live without a car, more than 50% of households live without a car. Car-free living is already here, and we just have to recognize it for what it is and build on it. That is my story. So let's look at Utrecht. Utrecht, 300,000 people, the city itself, the region about 1 million. In the center of Holland, the node of the railway network, with also reasonably good bus-based public transport. And we cycle. So we analyzed job accessibility in 30 minutes by public transport. And we plotted it as a distance from the center. So we took all the neighborhoods in the region, and we plotted them on how far are they from the city center. And on the y-axis, we put how much accessibility do you have compared to the average by car in the entire region. Okay? So if it would be 1, if the neighborhood has accessibility of 1, then it has exactly the same as the average person with a car in the region. And we plot the neighborhoods in terms of the number of low-income people. So from 200, the lightest version, up to 400 people in a neighborhood. Now in Holland, we have quite a mixed neighborhood structure, so we don't have so strong concentration of poverty. And so what is the pattern that we see in Utrecht if we map this? We actually see the following. This is based on only public transport, okay? And we see that there's only one neighborhood where, if you live there, you can get to half of the jobs that the average car driver can get to in the region, okay? It's not people living in the city center of Utrecht. If you live in the region with a car, you can get to 1, and in the best neighborhood, you can get to half of that by public transport. And most people can get to much less. Now, if you would draw a sufficiency line somewhere, let's say at 50% of the average car, and say, okay, we think it's enough that you have access to half of the average. That should be enough. Like we do with income, right? There's an income distribution, there's a certain line where we say, this is enough. You can live on that a decent life, kind of. Well, then we see that actually there's a huge amount of people and neighborhoods very close to the city center, 5 up to 10 kilometers not far away, they don't have enough accessibility. Again, these are our potential post-car neighborhoods. If we draw a lower line, 20%, we still are not talking about far-fetched neighborhoods, little towns. We still have a lot of neighborhoods very close to the city center of Utrecht, on the edge of the city itself, the big suburbs, where lots of low-income people live, and they still don't have enough accessibility. And that's when we put a very low standard, right? 1 in 5 jobs, that's what you get. Compared to the average, not to the best person, no, to the average, right? Now we can also compare this, and we can add the bicycle as a means, and I think it's an interesting insight for many, many cities that don't have cycling so much. Because if you move from measuring only public transport, only accessibility by public transport, towards measuring accessibility by either public transport or public transport plus the bicycle, so you cycle to the train station or to the bus stop and then you travel further on, or you just cycle to your destination, we see quite a substantial jump in accessibility. So here we go and jump. Right, you jump nicely up, accessibility goes up, especially if you're close to the city center. If you're far out, it goes up a little bit, but not so much anymore. And then again, if we draw a 50% line, 10, 15 neighborhoods are above the line. Only, that's all. There's so much to do still here, very close to the city. And if we draw 20%, we're still talking about the area 5 to 10%, 10 kilometers of the city center. We're not talking about the periphery. Insufficient accessibility is everywhere around us. And if we use that as a tool to be a car-free living, then actually we can move, I think, inclusively to a post-car city. So I presented this philosophy where the tendency seems to be the focus is on people that could live with 1 or 2 or 3 cars even, but they have a different mindset and they are willing to live car-free. And we're ignoring a huge population group that exists that has no car or 1 car or goes in and out of car ownership who already live in car-free. Now, if we would use that potential and we would provide them with good accessibility, they would remain car-free. And other people who want to live car-free will maybe move into those neighborhoods and live also car-free. And then we have a mixture of populations that are both people who with constraints and people out of choice living car-free, and gradually will expand our post-car city. And so for me, transport justice is a lever. Rather than having this image of a car-free city where you can ask, why is it so important? Why do we have to live car-free? There are all kinds of good reasons, but can't we solve it in different ways? Should we really be car-free? I think transport justice is a much more powerful argument that says everybody deserves sufficient accessibility. And if that is the case, then we should start building towards that goal. In the end, we will go to the periphery, but we will start in a city where many people are living with insufficient accessibility. And if we can improve their situation, they will remain living without a car. They will be the car-free future. And so my appeal for those working towards a post-car city is focus on where households without cars are already, and then think about how we can enhance their accessibility by public transport, investments in cycling, improving walkability. We will keep them carless out of choice, and the constraint will slowly become a choice. Some people might still desire the car, but they will be satisfied with a car-free living for years. And if we do this systematically, and we realize that congestion is not our problem, insufficient accessibility is our problem, we will gradually expand those zones of accessibility. And so our city will gradually actually become more and more car light, not carless, but car light. And so I think that if we use transport justice as a guiding anchor for our transport policy, we will automatically, gradually build this car-free city that people desire. But it comes from an ambition that's much more inclusive, that is not elitist, that doesn't only talk to people that have a different attitude towards cars, that have an environmental ambitions. It will talk to a much wider population, and it will also enable people who have a different attitude towards cars to live that life. It will be an inclusive transformation rather than one that sets up one population group, highly educated, white-collar workers, environmentalists, against lower educated people that still desire for the car. So here I leave it. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Karel, for this different perspective, also in terms of priority that could address planning and mobility policy for reaching transport justice. So I leave the floor to two discussants. If you agree, could start Ezio Manzini and then Morena Pivetti.
In English.
Yes.
Preferably.
In Italian English is easier for everybody.
We are going to speak a much
It's
less good English than he does. So
He
Yeah.
has good English. My one
Yeah.
is Italian English, so it's easier, so relax.
Playing a home game, and I'm playing an out game, right? So we're in
In,
balance.
in my case, it's the only game that I'm capable to play, the Italian English. In any case, so good afternoon, thank you for inviting me. I did my homework because I imagined that the rule of the game was a little bit different, but now I've been challenged from everything I listened today, this morning, and also this afternoon. So I will start with some reaction. I will try to say something that I wanted to say, and you stop me when I have to be stopped. I don't want
I
to...
suppose that we have to conclude at 4:30. It's true? Okay, so we have time.
So what I liked very much, so I learned a lot from the speech that has been done, and I like very much something. First of all, in this moment, it's a political statement, this one that I'm going to do. I think that we cannot do and say anything without taking care of the problem and the many problems, but in particular the social problem of the injustice, of the differences, etc. So to deal about this issue, focusing on how to try to reduce or to avoid this kind of distance in between who has and who has not, who are powerful and who are fragile, I think that this is very good. It's a very good way of starting a conversation. So very thanks for that. Secondly, I have to say something about myself. Sorry, it's not so interesting per se, but what I am supposed to be an expert in service design. So this is my also academic. More specifically, I deal with service in relation to social change. So it's service design related to social change. That could be said collaborative services. And this is the way in which I will look to everything. So it's one point of view that maybe is not the same of many other people here. And I like it a lot when discussing about the carless and car-free city. Here I to say, but we have to make a switch in the perspective. And the switch in perspective starts telling there is a veil of ignorance. And afterward, you said something about the difference. So when you really break this veil and you move on the other side, what you see, or you can see some average human being, but if you really try to go behind the veil, you see the differences. Some extreme differences, but in general, we are all different. And therefore, in my view, the implication, the main implication is really this change of point of view. And what does it mean to look to the real people for what they are? And by this point of view, when you arrive to your implication, in my view, you started, for what I've understood, maybe I've not understood everything, but for what I understood, it was not so much looking things by this point of view, but it was again very interesting. I learned a lot also for that. But considering average movement, situation, structure of the transportation in mobility in different systems. So maybe this is also something that could be switching the perspective, but I will try to say something adopting what for me is changing the perspective. And what I've learned this morning, I think that everybody was this morning here, maybe everybody knew, but I'm not in the mobility community, and for me has been very new, the idea of the mass mobility as a system, that afterwards has been upgraded in, at least for me, upgraded in a MAC, mobility as a community, or a mobility as a service for community. That for me, this is really a change. And it's really the change because for me, if you use the term service, by definition, you have to take care about the people and the very specific interaction. So service have many different definitions, but the one that me and my colleagues, we use is interaction in between human beings in which these human beings try to do something together that they recognize the value, all the people involved in the service. So by definition, the service tended to go toward the people and the interaction. Afterward, in the tradition of the service, there has been the traditional mechanistic way of looking how you can design and how you describe society, trying to generate some procedure to reduce the human component of services, to some procedure that makes that everybody has more or less to operate following some standards. But after a while, many people recognized, and more people recognize, that you cannot reduce the human dimension of service, and so we started to talk about relational service, so service based really on relationships, and relationship is something that is very human. And so you arrive to a kind of paradox, because if the services are a human relationship, you cannot design them, because you cannot design the relationships. And therefore, to conclude, is what you can design is to design some context, it can have different way, different names, some enabling system that give more possibility for people, more probability that people could behave in a certain way, even though you are not sure of what will really happen. So all this to say that in the moment in which you start to really take seriously that there is a service, if you take the service in this upgraded way, you have to get very deep inside the issue. And so what happens in my point of view? It happens that you cannot talk about mobility as mobility. So until a certain moment, when it's more an infrastructure, there is a mobility that is offered in a certain way. But when you arrive, as was in the picture, to see the very old man as me, or you see the people that have some handicap, or see the mobility solution, the real mobility, the fact that you have to go from A to B, is one of the elements of the overall complexity of system that make it possible. So in some way, I will not say at all that is not needed some special knowledge for what regard mobility, but the special knowledge has to be included in a frame in which you keep in account of so many different things. And this is why, in my view, it becomes really a service in the new sense of the term, at least for me, because also the traditional service, mobility service was services. But this one, if you start to move in this direction, it becomes something in which the system for mobility is totally linked. So if I have an elderly people that have to go from the point A to the point B, it's not only to move from the point A to the point B, but say who help him, who create, how you organize it, how you organize the leaving, how you organize the arrival, what happens in the meantime. So there are so many other things that technically are not strictly related in what has been considered transportation until now. So I think that is, I'm also very happy because I see convergence in between many different people. Okay, this is more the reaction. The bridge in between this observation toward what I was thinking to say is many people also, he talks about the philosophy behind the car-less vision. Many people said also today, I remember very well, somebody said, with all the money of the new plans, can we solve the problem? Even if we imagine to have all the more money to change the system, it's not enough because something has to happen also in the mind of the people. And what has to happen in the mind of the people? So again, I liked everything that I learned this morning. I think that the term careless or carefree is a little bit reductive in relation to what I've heard. So I'm much more in agreement with everything that has been said than with the title. Because the problem is not to have a carless or car-free, because, okay, we can say that a car is also a status, but it's not that the problem. The problem, the issue is which kind of city are we imagining? And the kind of city that we are imagining could be a city or a territory in which it's necessary to move from point A to point B to point C and long distance or not. So it's the vision about the city that generates the possibility really to make many different changes, including the one that you do not use the car so much. And as you can imagine, given the way in which it has been introduced, for me the key words is proximity. And proximity is much more deep and dense than to talk about 10 minutes, 50 minutes, etc. Because these are slogans that, as all the slogans, can take some point and lose something else. But proximity is a very deep and philosophical issue. And it's a very deep and philosophical issue that is in the mind of the people if you want proximity or not. And therefore, okay, you have to reorganize everything, moving toward being in a proximity, in a dense and diversified proximity system or not. But this is the topic. It's not so much how many minutes you take to go there. And to say what is the point for me is the comeback of the body in the story. So switching the point of view, those image icons are not icons, are people, physical people with their own body. And all the discussion about proximity, and you will have noted that proximity is a very normal term, it always existed. But if we had a kind of index, let's say how many people, how many times it's used this term now, it is booming. Even too much, as all the very successful world, it could risk to be burned. But there are some reason, and the reason is that for some motivation, we are rediscovering something that is very obvious when we tell it. But the very obvious thing is that we discover that we can move, we can go in the metaverse or in the digital space or whatever, but we have a body and our body is somewhere. So there is a topology. There is a very important point in which we say where we are and what we do with our physical body. And why it is so important. Okay, if I had more time to talk, but I won't tell, there is all the story how the medieval, the pre-modern city that was by definition a city of modernity. So Italy has some quasi 50-minute city because there are some remaining of the medieval. But the core of the medieval was that the people had to be nearby because it was the only way. There was no other way. And so it was also very hybrid. It was very diverse. It was with a high level of promiscuity. The rich was always together to the poor because the poor need the rich and the rich need the poor. And they had only a way to be, one floor for the rich and another floor for the poor. because they have to be nearby. And at a certain point, somebody said, no, but we can have the Garden City, or we can have the Ville Radieuse, that could appear so diverse. But they have something in common. They want to purify, to make more clear, to make more hygienic, less promiscuous. And therefore, there has been a very strong idea that the good city is the city in which the rich live all together some way, the poor will live all together in another way, the factory are out because they are polluting, the shops are all together, etc., etc. So behind all this, there was not the idea of the car. Yes, maybe also there has been some push, in Italy for sure, by the car manufacturer, but there was a vision, and the vision linked to a dream, and the dream is the car is the dream, the American dream of freedom, the cowboy. They can go take the horse and go where he wants and get down where he wants. And so this has been sold. It has been sold the idea that the car is freedom. So an idea of hygiene, an idea of mass, so the bigger the best, so big concentration of everything because it was more effective, and the dream of having this kind of mobility. Of course, after 20 years, after 1 century, we see. But it was strong. It was not simply that people want to show off with the car. That it was something very deep and also in some ways serious. So now we have to create another vision, another scenario that should have the same power. That do not mean that now, oh my God, everything is interconnected. Yes, but we are not to think that there is some place where we can command everything. The city is chaotic by definition. It's a mixture of so many different things. So how it can change? It can change only if there are some attractors. So many different people, many different groups, many different institutions, relatively independently, have a component that goes in the same direction. So for 1 century, the direction was, let's use all the technology, all the capability in organizational terms to have the possibility to live also if you are not nearby. And they made a good job by this point of view. Now, I think for the sake of sustainability, for the sake of the quality of society and care, because as I said before, the main topic, the main concept about what should be a sustainable society is a society that care in between the people and care between the people and the environment. And care, by definition, is tactile. You need to be nearby. You cannot care really by internet. You can only care if you are near. And therefore, if you don't have cities that are in this way promiscuous, in proximity, you cannot have cities that care. So what we have to propose is the idea of cities that care, that have the capability to care. Oh, now, to care without car. So this could be, but no, sorry, cities that care. And for me, this is the core of the story, the switch that should be done. And everybody moving from being in transport to being in healthcare and social issue should move in the same direction, creating the image of proximity. And the image of proximity is not the image of the little village, the little neighborhoods. Some of the images that I saw also in your presentation, in my view, are not the city of proximity because they are too homogeneous. So they could be without car, but they are not with that kind of density, diversity that we need to have proximity. So it's not enough to have the possibility to live without car. You need to live in a condition in which you can have an offer and accessibility to many things that offer you the possibility to meet people every day or every 2 days, and from there to start conversation, and starting conversation, creating also, recreating, regenerating the social fabric.
I don't know if... I don't know if Karel and Morena would like sì, scusate. I don't know if Karel or Morena will interact with this suggestion or...
Speak about a totally different topic.
Okay, so Karel and then...
Thanks for your thoughts. They're very inspiring, and I like the idea to care without a car. I think it could be to capture a kind of a development that you want to go to. It captures multiple things, and it's about people and not about systems, which is what I try to say. I think, although in the end, transport is a system that you need to design, and you design it always for collectives. So my concern is always, if you talk about transport and when you talk about justice, that people take it to small communities, people that have disabilities and they're not being served well. And I'm not sure if this is what you meant with mobility as a service for a community or a relational service. But in my perspective, if you want to change the transport system, it is really about changing the big budgets that we are spending. And the big budgets are being spent on major infrastructure projects, which basically take us where you don't want to go, which is a life without proximity, a life with long distances, a life of high speed, but only for those who can afford it, and not for all of us. And if we would use those enormous funds to build a system that is partly very tailor-made, but partly also very structural, I think we will gradually move towards a city of proximity. I mean, rather than further speeding up the system or trying to maintain the high-speed system we have via the roads, if you would start investing in people that have low accessibility, you basically try to, you're not speeding up the system, you are rebalancing the system, and the existing system will probably get slower. Right? We currently use our budgets to keep traffic flowing, and basically means we either enhance speed by new roads, or at best we keep it as the status quo, which means a life of high speed for some. Now, if we take those budgets and move them to cycling, walking, public transport, then the fastest system, which is the car system today, will gradually become somewhat slower because it will remain congested and become more severely congested, and until we have an alternative system that provides high quality. And so it goes together hand in hand to some extent with generating proximity, with giving priority to things that are close by, with people also making choices, I think, gradually to things that are close by. At the same time, I think that our wealth in society is built also partly on speed. And we should not ignore that. We can only be here together as experts in transport because there is something like a transport expert, and a transport expert only exists because we can serve huge communities. If we would all be in small communities, nobody would be in need of a transport expert. There wouldn't be a full-time job for a transport expert. Maybe in some city, but in most places not. So, and this is the simplest example, but obviously the economies of scale and scope that speed has generated are worth a lot. And we should not easily give those up, I think, but we should achieve them in a much more sustainable way. And possibly also with our modern technologies and organizational structures, we can have more economies of scope and scale without speed, possibly. But I think we still need some speed somewhere. So this is my first thought, but I really like the idea of care without a car and the idea of a caring society, which I think resonates very good with my transport justice. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, in my opinion, also about the title that we give to the report. So we're thinking about this title that is at the end a new not a new title, but a post-car city, in order to avoid the idea that we would like to propose a free car city, and but we would like to think about a new system of priority built around the accessibility by proximity that you mentioned, and also the idea to use the term verso una post-car city, no? In Italian, una, not verso la post-car city, because it's not one model, it's not an unique model, but we could decline it in a very different way in order also to avoid stereotype solutions that often are in the example that you produce about the free car cities, no? In which also the quality of the public space is the same everywhere, and also at the end, as in the case of Vienna, are high educated, high income. So at the end are a system that produce a lot of inequalities and is not so relevant. But working, as I mentioned this morning, to achieve a proximity, at the end shift completely also the idea that we need new infrastructure, we need a new public transport supply, and then combine a very different design solutions also in order to achieve the problem that you mentioned. So the idea that this mobility is not displacement between a point A, a point and B, but is a social spatial practice. This means that are different the needs of persons that move, and also different are solutions. Okay. I don't know if Oder would like to interact about these specific issues, because okay. Yeah.
I'll introduce myself. I'm not a professor. I'm a journalist, and I've been writing about transport and logistics for the past 25 years. So this is why I've sort of become an expert. And I would go back to basic, because it's very interesting what we are talking about. But if you don't start from the reality we are living, and we are talking about dreams. Excuse me if I'm so strong, but I'd rather be provocative at this point. So let's go back to basic. Basic is that from the latest survey made by Eastfort, I think the Italian people know Eastfort because it's the survey organization that has tested the public transport for the last 21 years. The share of public transport in Italy is 7.5% of all the daily movements of the people, of the daily mobility of people. And we have gone down from 10% before the pandemic to 7.5%. So the pandemic has left us much worse off than before. It was not a time in which to discover new ways of moving around, leaving the cars, but what we found out is that people are using the car more than before, and we are not able to go back to the way that public transport was used before the pandemic. Also, even what we call we say mobilità dolce, cycling and walking. Even if the government has put some millions of euros enabling people to have a free e-bicycle and e-scooters, this hasn't changed a lot the habits at all, the habits of people. So the use of car has improved, and we are not able to go back as we were before. Of course, the situation is different in the different parts of Italy. So if we talk about Milan, Milan is the only city where the use of car has decreased because the policies of the city have enabled people to be able to live without a car. In Rome, vice versa, the situation is that we have more car than driving licenses, which means that a person with a license has 2 cars. So, and we have so many cars in Rome that if there wasn't a share of cars moving around through the 24 hours, we wouldn't be able to park them because there wouldn't be enough space. So this is the reality we are dealing with, and so we have 2 cities that are free of cars, which are Venice and Capri. But one is because it's on water, and the other one because it's in island. We are seeing an improvement because young people have a different perspective of cars. So they don't want to be owners of cars. They hire them or they share them. And we have less people taking their driving license, which in Italy, you don't take it at school. You have to pay in order to have it. So So this is encouraging because young people are discovering that they don't live the car as a status symbol as it was my generation, for example. So they use the different means of transport according to their needs. But this is just the young generation. It's not, the entire population is different. So when you talk about sufficient accessibility, you talked about accessibility to jobs. So I was wondering, and of course now we talk, it's both physical accessibility and also digital accessibility, because if you talk about the mobility as a service, you have to be digitally able not to use it, which is not the case for a number of people, old people or less educated people. So just, how would you go to define, beside to jobs, which other parameters or which other standards would you use to define accessibility so that, we can study in Italy how we can measure it? And I imagine we are not talking accessibility only by public transport, by a number of means, which include bicycles, e-bicycles, also walking, and also hiring private systems which are not individual but collective, like calling a taxi, like sharing a car, and so on. Now, the paradox that we live in Italy, and which I wanted to point it out to you, is that in reality, the people who choose not to own a car, or also the ones that can't own a car, they are not the poor people, because usually the people who can live without a car are the ones living in the center or in the semi-center of the cities, where, of course, the houses are more expensive. So we are providing public transport to the wealthier people, and we are not providing public transport to the poorest people who live in the suburb and in what was defined the urban sprawl this morning. So when you say 4 out of 5 do not have a car because they are not able to afford it, in Italy it sounds the reverse, that maybe you have an old car, which is why we have a very old, our car park is very old. It's older than the European one in average. But because the number of people, they do have to have a car, otherwise they can't go anywhere. And this is a problem of city planning, of course, because instead of planning the transport infrastructure first, what we do in Italy, what we have done in Rome until 5 years ago, we have 2 big neighborhoods in Rome called Ponte di Nona and, for example, Porte di Roma, that have no accessibility by public transport, and they have a very low accessibility by roads, so even by car. So people who live there, it takes them an hour to get everywhere in Rome. Also, we have to take into consideration that Rome is the more extended municipality in Europe. It is the biggest rural municipality in Europe, you wouldn't guess. And within the town of Rome, it contains the 10 biggest cities in Italy. So this is I'm talking about because I live in Rome. So, but that's where it's more difficult. Of course, in Milan it's easier. And then so if you consider transportation like health and education, we should have the same accessibility as we are having to education, which is for all, and also to health is for all. But my other question is, who pays for it? Are the users going to pay as they use it, or as, there is a debate in Italy about free public transport. Bari is adopting using regional EU funds. Their yearly subscription to public transport will go down from 250 euros to 20 euros. Genova is offering free rides in certain times and with certain means. So there is a debate going on. How much should the user pay, or should it be all on, we'll call it on the fiscal, on the taxes that everyone pays? So even the people who can't use public transport and are forced to use the car are going to pay for the public transport used by the rich who live in the center of the cities. This is one of the paradoxes we have been talking about. And my last question is, the other big debate is the 30 kilometers cities. as a way to discourage the use of car. Also, there's a problem of safety, because if you don't build enough cycle lanes and you use e-scooters and e-bicycle, we have had a huge increase in mortality and accidents in the big cities because of the use of e-bicycle and also of the people walking, not just using in Rome, for example. Instead of going down, that US standard that we have to reach, then I don't remember which means that we have to lower, the incidentality, and while in our biggest cities going up. So these are the questions I'd like you to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughts. It's sad to hear that public transport is going down, but I don't think it downplays its importance, for sure. Yeah, for me. Yeah.
If I may add,
Yeah.
the other thing that I have observed that is really bugging me, because I am pro public transport, and I've been writing about sustainable mobility for 25 years, is that both our Ministry of Environment and our Ministry of Transport in the last 20 years have put a huge amount of money, both in investment but also in sustaining the services. But we haven't seen an improvement at all, even of 0 point something. So you ask yourself, what has gone wrong? What should we do to increase, the use of public transport? Also when it is available, but people don't use it. And this is what is really bothering me, because then you go to other big cities and you see that it is used. But we haven't been able to improve it at all in 20 years, if we talk about percentage share overall.
It's the result of what you build, right? It's not that you invest a lot in public transport, you invest a lot in cars too. You keep extending roads, you keep providing parking for free, you keep subsidizing cars in many, many ways. Although the public feels they're paying a lot of money, you get what you saw. It's very simple. In Holland, it's exactly the same. Public transport is not increasing beyond a few core cities because we keep expanding roads and making it life easy for car users. You can park for free everywhere, except in the city centers. Well, that's a huge subsidy that everybody pays. That decreases densities for all of us, makes everything less convenient. So even though we have cycling and public transport in Holland, it's the same story. You get what you saw. And that's what Italy has been doing for 70 years. So you can't expect what we call huge budgets or tiny budgets. There are tiny budgets. We have been systematically taking away our public transport, our cycling infrastructure. Italy was a cycling country also. Yeah, all countries were cycling countries till the early 50s, and then it was just planned away. So we need 70 years to build a different society. We created a car-based society, and we're going to need 70 years to correct that. And why do we need to correct that? I think because the society is unfair. That's the most powerful argument. Cars are bad in many, many ways. They kill people, which I think is terrible and it's unacceptable. There's pollution. They consume huge amount of space. It's all true. But the most important, it's a system that doesn't serve everybody. And I think it's unacceptable in a rich society that you just say, for a certain group of people, good luck to you. You see how you manage. It's crazy. It's outrageous. And I think how this happened is because transport wasn't an issue when the welfare state was built. So the welfare state was built in Europe in the 50s and 60s. And it was very clear for everyone that if we don't make education free and healthcare free, or most of it free, then it won't be available for most people. But transport wasn't an issue, and it only gradually became an issue in the 70s when car ownership became dominant and cities started to organize gradually around the car. And then the momentum of the welfare state was already gone. And so this idea that we have to provide everyone with something, the problem came too late for that very progressive ambition of the 50s or mostly the 60s. That's my historical analysis of the problem. On top of this came the highly problematic engineering perspective, right? Which said that the problem in transport is that the system is not working, congestion is a failure of the system. The buses are empty, there's no problem. And so if you don't look at people, then you don't see the problem, right? As buses are empty, then congestion is then there's no congestion and no problem, you don't have to do anything. So there's two parallel developments that created a situation, and this rhetorics about huge investments in public transport are rhetorics. You should put them in historical perspective vis-a-vis how much we invested in the car. And the road system was built before the car owners started to pay their taxes. Okay, they were just expanded because we thought it was a good investment. I don't think it was necessarily a bad investment, but the way we made them freely available for people who could afford a car in the early decades of the 50s and 60s, that was clearly a huge subsidy for the well-to-do. They didn't pay for those roads. And the same should be the case now for public transport. Huge investments, even if it doesn't pay for it now, because it will pay itself back in the future, I think. So that's one. And there's nothing to do, you know. I think, you know, in a fair society has to enable everybody. Now, I'm a little bit concerned about your analysis, and I don't think it's correct, but I cannot, of course, show it with data. But the US is obviously a country that has the worst public transport system in the world. I think even worse than any African country, okay, where there's at least informal transit running for, you know, there's a huge amount of poor people for them. And it's amazing how many people in the US live without cars. It's 8.5% of the households, but if you calculate how many adults don't have cars, it's between 13 and 20% in metropolitan areas. So 1 in 5 in some metropolitan areas, including in Los Angeles, which is a car city, 20% of adults do not have access to a car. Now, even those who have access to a car and they're poor, often they don't use the car. Okay, they might have a car registered on them, but the car is so expensive that they won't use it. Or they will have a car that breaks down and then they have to collect money for 1 month, 2 months before they can run it again. Now, it's anecdotal evidence, but I studied in Holland, students researched cases, and so there was one immigrant family who came from former Yugoslavia, and they had a car. They would never, ever use it because it was too expensive to use, and they had the car to drive to Bosnia in the summer, where they took lots of stuff from Holland and to give it to the family members in Bosnia, and to take all kind of nice foods from Bosnia to Holland. That's why they had the car. And it was cheaper, of course, than flying to Bosnia or taking a train, which is outrageously expensive and certainly more convenient. And that's why they had a car. So having a car doesn't mean that you use it. And so it's surprising how many people in the suburbs in the US, where you think, how can you manage without a car, live without a car? And I suspect it's the same in Italy. Is public transport used by the rich in Italy? I don't think so. I think, yes, the high-speed rail, for sure. I don't think it's true for the buses. I would be very surprised. It's an empirical question, but I would be surprised. And certainly when cities still allow driving, and driving is cheap. So I think well, it would be great if the well-to-do would ride public transport, because then you also have critical political momentum to invest in public transport, right? But I think the situation is probably comparable to the US, where if you map where the low-income people live, that's also not so far out. Yes, poverty has moved out from the city centers, but there's still a lot in the cities, I think. But it's an empirical question, so there's no point to debate it. Yeah.
There are studies by the Milan Politecnico, by Marco Ponti, for example, that because if you live in the center of the town, you have a quality public transport service. So even if you are rich, you use it because it's quality and it serves you right.
Yeah.
But if you live in a suburb and you have a bus every 45 minutes instead of one every 5 minutes, and you have to get some places, then you have to have a car. That's what I mean. While
buses,
meaning that in reality, the rich not everywhere, but you know, I'm thinking about in Rome, for example. Yes, I'm sure that a lot of wealthy people use public transport because in the center it works. While the woman that comes to help me at home, of course, she takes it because it's the only way she has. But you know, it takes ages. So it's a service both for the poor. You are right, because a number of immigrants do not have a car, and so the only way they move around is by PT, even if they have to wait 3/4 of an hour to get a bus, because it's the only way they move. But there is this unwanted subsidy to wealthy people
Yeah, I would
in the
agree.
very centers of the cities. I don't think you can do anything about it. Just be aware, and I mean.
Well, you can't do anything about it through transport policy. You can do something through your housing policy, right? If you have strong social housing policies, you can change that. You can use and build on those situations, which we used to have in Holland. I don't know how we still have them. I don't know how it's in Italy. But it's clear that there's a general discourse, and it links to the discourse about car-free living, or right? It's public transport should be attractive, should be high quality, and so we invest a lot in a light rail system, and we spend most on it, and we reduce bus frequencies to have this wonderful light rail system, who serves mostly more well-to-do people. I agree. There's a big problem there, and so thinking systematically about who gets accessibility and how can we gradually increase it. It will not happen from today till tomorrow, but if we systematically do it, we will get to those suburbs where more and more low-income people live. Measuring jobs. So for me, you said, should we measure more? Yeah, we should measure more, but we should also get upset. Measuring jobs for me is not about measuring whether you can get to a job. It's like getting a sense of how easy you can get to many places, because jobs go together with all kinds of destinations. Hospitals have lots of jobs. City center has lots of jobs. Every shop has jobs. Schools have jobs. Jobs are everywhere, and it's a good measure, and it's better than just addresses, because addresses, you have lots of houses which offer very little to most people. So it gives you a general feeling how easy can you get around and get to places that are important. Now you can endlessly discuss about how you should measure accessibility, and there is no perfect measurement. They have all their limitations, but the differences in accessibility are so huge between people who have and those who don't have that it doesn't really matter how you measure it. You will always see certain groups highlighting those with low income, no cars, living not in the city center, just on the urban edge, big suburbs. That's where the concentrations are, no matter how you measure it. And so academics like to discuss how to measure accessibility. I think it's distracting from the real issue. Is like, let's figure out who is poorly served, and let's just agree on some measure, and we can do a test, what is the differences, but I think they will be rather modest if you think more in terms of standards and not about whether exactly the measure gets out well. Who pays for transport? Wow, that's a difficult one. Yeah, definitely. So in general, I'm not in favor of making transport free, because I think it leads to actually it damages the idea of proximity, and it creates the idea of that mobility comes for free and it's cheap. And mobility is a very expensive good, and it's not something you should give away so easily for free, and certainly not to the entire population. And I take the Dutch student population as an example. So since the 90s, the Dutch students get a free public transport card, and it creates a culture of very high mobility. They go from city to city, and students live in cities, and the cities are well connected by rail, and so they can travel for free everywhere. And this culture then is established when they're young, and obviously it rolls on when they are older. Now, maybe they for a while will use public transport, but at some point they will move into a car and have the same high mobility culture, which in itself is problematic, I think, for society. So I think it's not necessarily a good thing to do, although I can imagine you do it for certain low-income people, where you would give it for free, but then it creates stigmatization. It has all kind of other drawbacks. So it's a very delicate balance, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But if I'm over 65 and I can pay.
I agree. I always find it, I agree. I don't know why the majority of 65 people are very well off nowadays. They were actually very lucky. They bought the houses in the right time, and society was just getting better and better. I think the young people are much more struggling. Exactly. I think, of course, there are some elderly who are not so lucky, definitely. But it's like throwing good money after bad in a way. Yeah. 30-kilometer city tomorrow. It is outrageous that we have accepted so many dead people. There's no other sector in society where we accept this. It's crazy, and these people are against it. They think they will never get killed themselves. But statistically, we all will get killed some moment of time if we just live long enough. And I think it goes together with your vision of proximity. It actually goes together with not low speeds necessarily door to door. So the interesting thing is, if you move to low speeds, you can actually redesign your streets. You can redesign lots of your junctions. instead of having traffic lights where you just wait and then speed up to 70 again to the next light, you can drive 30 and you can have a roundabout and go quietly through the junction. And it doesn't necessarily make traveling so much slower, but it makes the city so much nicer, and it will actually make public transport also nicer, because waiting for a bus while the cars are driving 50, 60, 70 kilometers an hour is very unpleasant. Cycling, even if you have a free bicycle path, if they're driving like crazy next to you, it's not pleasant. Walking is not pleasant. I think it's something that makes so much sense, and it's only so difficult to get rid of it because we have allowed crazy speeds and have wiped away our children from the streets. And so one more anecdote. When I was between 6 and 14 years old, I lived in a small town, and the football was always in the middle of our street. That was how the street was us. We were the street, nobody else. And so we're talking the 70s here, and that's how the street was. And why do we give it up to people that want to get quickly to destinations? Why is it more important than me playing with my friends football in the street? And just going out and always knowing that the children were there, and I never had to call them or send them a message, shall we go and play, which I don't do anymore, of course. I think it's crazy. We created a crazy society. And children have been, ignored by us from the perspective that there's only temporary, right? You're only 10 years, 15 years a child, and then you're an adult, so who cares about those years? I think it goes perfect together with city of proximity. I think it's part of a better life and a reappreciation of children. And I think in Italy we need more children, not? That's what I understand. Yeah. Okay, anyway. So I'm in favor of 30 kilometers, and I think it's less dramatic than people think it is. Yeah, people overestimate the speed to travel at. And actually, when you make streets nice, driving 30 kilometers is fun. And when you make a street boring, driving 70 kilometers is boring, is annoying. But if you create nice streets with trees and people that cycle and it's life, and you drive 30 kilometers an hour, you think like, that's nice. There's people here. So it's also a sense of time. We don't really plan our life to the minute. We don't. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I collect also comments, questions from the audience, if there are. Because the time is over, but perhaps some of you would like to interact. Yeah. No, too much tired, everybody. Sì, prego.
So first of all, thank you very much for this very, very stimulating debate and for some concepts that have been stressed out during this session. I would just like to share a few notes and few takeaways from trying to create a link from this morning's session and what we have been listening in the afternoon session. So the takeaway of this morning's session, I personally started with a lecture on how to achieve a modal shift. And I ended up with the fact that maybe what we need to achieve is a cultural shift in order to create and to have a post-car city. And I was, let's say, even more convinced by what Ezio Manzini said in his lecture. Basically, actually, it is a cultural shift that we need in order to achieve a modal shift. So we should try to create, let's say, a less lifestyle oriented towards car and more to public transport. Then I create a connection with what you said, car-free and car-less. So demotorization. And I like very much the comparison between these two approaches to achieve a post-car city, the philosophy adoption that you show, in which basically the demotorization is a sort of end of a process in which you try the car and then you move towards a more efficient or a less. But are we sure that car-free people are those that actually need a car? And so they shift towards a car-free model because they don't need actually a car. And at the same time, carless people, are we sure that those people, if were able to get a car, would not use it? So I think that in your presentation, you suggest that this car-free, carless area that we could identify in an area are those in which we need to look into in order to provide them a better public transport service and to achieve an accessibility. But a warning is be sure that that would not be then not used, because actually carless is not a choice. It's something related to no income or no ability to use a car. And finally, last takeaway that is also related to what Ezio Manzini and Morena Pivetti mentioned, proximity. Well, I like very much the concept of a service as something that requires a physical interaction between people. But my point is, are we sure that the society, future society, would like to have a physical proximity? I am thinking of young generation that are more and more living on the web and interacting using social, and also the concept of the metaverse, so we could talk about of that. But are we sure that physical proximity is the future? Because in that respect, maybe what we need in order to achieve the cultural shift is investing in young generation, and this is also related to the question of the incentives. Maybe the incentives should go in the direction of educating young generation to use public transport, maybe also with the free cards, in order to get them used to this mode of transport and also this culture of interacting again.
Okay, thank you. I have just a question for Carol. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. But in many books, you talk about accessibility, and you stated many times this is very important for fair transport to access to the right services or to the fundamental services. But as we know, the fundamental services change a lot, and over the time and across different countries. And so how is possible to build a fair transport system and in different contexts in order in your opinion, and the fair transport system is to access fundamental services, and fundamental services are completely different for elderly people, for young people, for one country and another country. So how is it possible to measure or to evaluate this one, in your opinion?
I'm trying to respond first to Pierluigi. Just one thing I picked up. I would agree that people who live now carless would prefer to have a car. We build a world around the car, and so the rational thing to do is to buy a car. And it's only people who have the luck that they can live in close proximity to their destinations and who can manage to live in city centers because they have enough income to live there, who can live without a car out of choice. And it's only a choice because they know that tomorrow they can buy a car if they need a car. So it's a choice, it's really a choice that is also open-ended. It's not a closed choice. And it makes it also a comfortable choice. And it's also a choice that you don't need a car to show that you're successful, because you are successful anyway. You live in a city center, you're highly educated, you're a white-collar worker. You're doing fine. But the fact that carless people do not want to travel as they travel doesn't mean that they have an option. So there are continuously people, of course, that are now carless, moving out of being carless and tomorrow having a car. But there are other people moving inside. And so they might have had a car, or they might just be young people and have no car and be low income. So this population is persistent. It's not disappearing. And so although it's still decreasing gradually in the US, there's still 8.5% of households in the US that is carless. And as I said, a substantial more adults without a car continuously available. It's a persistent group. It will not disappear. And so if we make it more easy for them, it doesn't mean that their aspiration for having this wonderful car disappears. But, you know, as I have many aspirations of having a nicer house or doing this, and I now gradually see, like, I don't think it's ever going to happen in my life, but, you know, it's not that important after all. This might be also the case for many people. They would still dream of that car, but realize that life is okay. But the life will only be okay if we invest in them. And so realizing that they are car-free, even involuntary, doesn't mean that we can ignore them and say, oh, they want the car, let's deliver the car or build a car-based society. I think the solution of giving car subsidies is worse. It has been tried in the US. It works well for a few months, cars break down, people can't maintain the car, and they roll back into the same situation. A car is very, very expensive if you're on low income. So I think we should face that we have this group of people, and we can enrich that group with car-free people, but only if you invest for those people first. Then there will be more and more car-free people too, and maybe carless people will more and more feel like, you know, actually life is good. That's my hope. And I think it's our duty. It's our duty. Services change over time. I didn't completely understand what you meant to say by that. Like land use is a self-organizing system to some extent, right? So the moment we build a system that's more inclusive, it will automatically continuously reorganize itself for everyone. Now it reorganizes continuously for the dominant group, right? Out of town shopping centers with free parking. They are also in Italy, and unless we change the system, that pressure will all the time be there. Now, if we change the system that becomes more inclusive and gradually build a system that serves everyone, then land users will also start reorganizing because it becomes more attractive to be in that city of proximity because many people can get to you. And so it will be, hopefully, start organizing spontaneously around a system that serves everyone. Now, it's complex. If I look at the Dutch cities now, Amsterdam, but also Utrecht, you know, cycling is really, really growing very fast. And so part of the decrease in public transport use is actually because cycling became more attractive. Part of it is the e-bike, allows you to cycle over larger distances. Part of it is better infrastructure. And part of it is public transport and the corona crisis. But that is also not inclusive for everyone. There are so many cyclists that it's very difficult if you're older aged and cycle in. So it's very difficult to build an inclusive system. It's very, very complex. But as long as you're aware of the diversity of people, then we can do it. And I think we shouldn't be scared of how we measure it. We have been measuring something fundamentally wrong all the time. Is traffic flowing, yes or no? How many hours are lost in congestion? People are there out of choice. Is that important? If you choose to lose your time, good, up to you. But actually the story is opposite. Those not in congestion lose much more time. Right? They stand in the bus stop, walk 15 minutes to the bus stop, wait for 15 minutes, drive 45 minutes, and then finally get there. I'm exaggerating, but that's the situation. They lose much more time. But we just don't measure it as lost time because the bus runs according to its schedule. But they are losing the real time. And so we should measure the right thing, and there are different ways to measure it properly. So one thing, rather than measuring accessibility, which is very difficult, we should measure who is having travel problems, who has mobility problems. Now, that's a little bit abstract, but I did a survey in Israel where I asked this question. How easy was it? No, did you experience difficulties getting to your destination? Did it take too much time? Did it cost too much money? Was it too uncomfortable? I asked them, were you dependent on other people? Could you have got there without somebody else? And I asked, in the past days, did you not travel somewhere because transport was so bad that you didn't travel there? Now, if you ask questions about difficulties of travel, you get a completely different spectrum of problems. So, traffic congestion in Tel Aviv region is terrible, terrible. And so, yes, they report that they waste lots of time, but the people who don't have a car systematically report much more problems. Transport is too expensive, it is very uncomfortable, they are continuously dependent on other people, and they forgo lots of trips. They don't travel to destinations. And so if you ask the right questions, you get the right answers. And you see all of a sudden two things. Okay, what came out of the survey is actually 2/3 of the population in Tel Aviv, where congestion is terrible, and most of my respondents had cars, said everything, except a little delay of some of my trips, everything is fine. I have no problems, which is a very different story from the media in Israel, who says all that, oh, congestion is a drama. And there's a small group that has serious problems. So you have two things. First of all, you can measure your success. I actually built a system that serves most of our people well, in spite of congestion. And I have a group of people that are seriously served very poorly. Now, if I would repeat this survey over and over again, I have a more simple measure than accessibility, which is very complex and difficult to understand, which can actually show more and more people are happy with my system, less and less people are poorly served. How beautiful. So I think we can use more tools to tell the right story and steer the system in the right direction. And until we start doing that, if we measure the wrong thing, we will keep doing the wrong things, right?
Okay, thank you so much. We have to conclude, and I thank so much Karel Martens, Ezio Manzini, Morena Pivetti, and also Pierluigi Coppola, because summarize the takeaway from this interesting session. I leave the floor to the organizer of Urbanit. No, so possiamo concludere quindi qui. Grazie molte e buona serata a tutti. Grazie.